going for the next half an hour. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Martine, Kilian, and Hidde. And Martine, maybe you could give a quick introduction about yourself.
Hi, I'm Martine, and I'm a UX UI developer. My pronouns are she, her. Currently, I have long hair up and bun. I'm wearing a gray sweater, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And Kilian, maybe you could introduce yourself to us as well.
Hi, I'm Kilian Valkhof. I'm the founder of Polypane. I'm a white male in my 30s, wearing a gray sweater, and my pronouns are he, him.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Hidde, if you could introduce yourself to our audience. I think you're possibly on mute.
Yeah, there we are. I think I'm unmuted now. Sorry for that. So I'm Hidde. I'm a front-end developer and accessibility consultant, also in my 30s. I am a white male wearing a blue shirt today, and pronouns are he, him.
Awesome. Thank you very much, everybody. So we've got about 25 minutes to go through just some questions to try and get some extra information out for our audience. The first question that we have is, do you find that developers know all of the options that they have available to them in order to make websites more accessible? Martine, maybe you could start off answering this one.
There's so much out there that no, I don't think that usually developers know, even if they know, like even me today, if I were to create a new website, I know a lot about accessibility, but there's always more, right? There's always something else. There's new technology evolving every day. Even the web, new features are pushed every day. So I think that there's always more that can be learned, and especially if you're new to accessibility, I find that the sheer amount of information available can sometimes be in and of itself a barrier to entry, which is kind of really interesting if you're thinking of the whole picture. But thankfully, I think there's a lot of new resources out there, and the spec website has been doing a lot better job, especially in the last several years, getting some of that information a lot more easy to read and with a lot more information. So I find that, does everybody ever know everything? No. Is there places we can find some of that information? Yeah, so I think that's kind of nice.
Okay. Hidde, do you have anything that you would like to add to that, or?
Yeah. My answer to the same question would probably be a bit of both. Like, it is easy to find information for developers, and a lot of accessibility problems in the wild aren't of the difficult category. So in that sense, it should be easy. But on the other hand, a lot of information is hard to find, especially when it comes to more advanced components and patterns. So yeah, there's still a lot for us to do as people teaching web accessibility to make it a lot easier to apply accessibility.
Okay. I'd like to move on to the next question, and I'm going to put this one to Kilian then, which is, bearing in mind we do have so much that we can do, and there is too much for any individual to know. What do you feel is the best bang for buck steps that somebody trying to create an accessible application or an accessible website can take to get them started and to make it, the most accessible for someone who's starting, say?
Yeah, so I think the nice thing about the web is that you can adapt it incrementally. Like you don't have to know all the technologies to build a website. You can start with what you know and then build on that. So then you very quickly go back to like the classic structure, like start with the HTML, learn how to build a website using HTML that describes the content, that, using semantic HTML, because that will get you the farthest, the fastest, because it affects all the other things. So definitely, like, make sure your HTML is well structured, is semantically correct, and only then move on to, making sure CSS with JavaScript that it's visually correct, it's visually accessible. Yeah, so that would be definitely the structure I would follow.
Okay. Do you have anything to add to that, Kilian? Sorry, Hidde?
I think what Kilian said is great. That's a really good basis to start with.
Okay, and if I can come back to you, Martine, I think this one goes quite nicely onto your talk with the tables, because I am old enough to remember when we did everything with tables and it was absolutely hideous. And I'm also can remember when everything was then changed and we weren't supposed to use tables because it was absolutely hideous. And now we have how we're supposed to use it for actual tabular data and make things accessible. Are there other things that you've seen come circle like that inside of the web development world, where things that we've abused in the past, we can actually now use to our advantage and make our life, or make the life of our users better?
The first one that comes to mind is, especially with Angular and React, and I poke on these two, but it's really true of most JavaScript frameworks. It's so easy to put an on-click on just about anything, whether it's supposed to have an on-click, if it's a button or otherwise, right? And I think that more than anything, the awareness that that's a bad idea has gotten a lot better. And so I think we're finally seeing that trend, or I'm hoping diminish, because people are becoming a lot more aware that that's just not a good idea. So I think that is one that I'm happy to see go away. But yeah, that's the first one that came to mind, I think, is just the on-clicks not being, and people just becoming aware that it might be easy to do, but has its own problems.
Yes, I can't help but think back to my one of the jobs that I've been in, where it was, you know what, we really want this to look like a button, but that's too hard, so we're just going to make this div look like a button and stick an on-click in there. Nobody will ever know. Okay, if I can go back to you then, Hidde, for the next question. And this one, I think, is a really important one to get started, and that is, who do you think should take ownership for making sure that the product that is being developed is accessible to the end users?
Yes, so when you try to think of specific roles, like, is it going to be the developer or like the designer or maybe some manager in the team? I see a lot of teams kind of make that mistake, and I feel like this would actually be something that everyone has responsibility for. So when accessibility works best, it is when kind of the whole team is aware that accessibility is necessary and kind of takes responsibility within their own area. And then you can have like a specific person maybe making sure that actually happens, or maybe starting some of that. But ultimately, I think everyone needs to have their own responsibilities within accessibility. And it's also like accessibility is something that most of the roles can contribute something to, whether it's designers, developers, or content folks, or even project managers. They can do stuff that can make accessibility better, like maybe ordering captions for a video that's gone online or something like that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Kilian, could I put the same question to you?
Yeah, I don't really have much to add.
Okay. Martine, do you have anything extra to add to that?
Not really. I can mirror the same thought that everybody has definitely their own role that they can play, and there's always something they can bring to the table when it comes to accessibility. That's one of the things I hear often from back-end people is or primarily focused back-end developers are like, well, I'm on the back end, there's nothing I can do. And it's like, there's always something, even if it's just an opinion or a thought on, and maybe an area that got overlooked, or writing the API in a way that makes it easier to make the front end more accessible. There's always something and everybody can do.
Okay. If I could extend the question then just a little bit and stay with you here, Martine. Have you helped companies, designers, the back-end developers? Have you done anything in the past, or what have you done in the past to see how you can help these people see the importance of making sure that what we're building is accessible?
I think under the importance bit, I find is the hardest hurdle for people to grasp, and then to make the jump between, yes, we understand it's important, but actually taking action towards it. So I got lucky that several of the projects I worked on, it was asked for from us. So it made the whole concept of getting it started not that bad because it was being asked for. The projects where it hasn't, I find that the easiest way to get them started is to just start doing it in your work and to bring it, mention it, like in the code review, put a comment. It's like, we're doing it this way because of accessibility, or bringing up that, hey, if we do it maybe during story grooming, if you're doing agile, bringing up, hey, if we do it the slightly different way, then it'll be more accessible. And you start seeing people kind of getting it and kind of starting to kind of follow. And I find that when there isn't that mandatory, like, you need to do this as part of this project and you're needing to kind of lead in, that kind of gentle leading by example tends to work quite well.
Okay. Hidde, have you done anything in this way to try and help people see the importance or help people get started?
Yeah, I kind of think of it as like a toolkit. Like, there's different arguments to be made for web accessibility, and some of these arguments work better on specific people. So, like, there's people in the team who are going to be convinced by just legal arguments, like, it's the law, or it is going to be the law in a few years, and that works. Others will be more convinced by empathy-based arguments, like, this is what we're supposed to do, it just makes sense to do. And maybe technical people even are going to be convinced by arguments like, if you write clear and structured markup that is semantic, then it's easier to maintain because you can then more easily see what's in your code. So, like, there's a lot of different arguments to be made, and I kind of try to switch between them and see kind of whatever works best. Ultimately, I think the legal argument is the easiest, especially people higher up are usually going to want to see an argument like that. That is the sad reality. Sometimes statistics work, like if you talk about, 1 in 5 people has a disability, so that's a lot of users that you miss out on. That sometimes work, but yeah, I think the legal argument for me is the most effective when I use that.
Okay, Kilian, do you have anything different that you've done?
So what I find is that a lot of times it's also just knowing about the issue. As I said earlier, you can get started with HTML and create the worst website ever, and your browser will just display it. It'll look fine. It'll do what you think it does. You can click all the things, and even though they're divs with on-click handlers, you click the thing and the browser does the thing. So it's very easy to not be aware of any issues, and just creating that awareness already helps. And then from there on, to really make it stick, you have to do what Hidde and Martine said, and you could go into things like making sure accessibility is part of your definition of done, and it's part of your testing, like Anton, What one of the other speakers mentioned earlier, like, make sure that people are confronted with it, essentially.
Yeah. Okay. And then when we get started, when we allow people to get started, Are there any pitfalls or the big mistakes that people can do that they think they're doing the right thing when they start with this, but they're actually not? Hidde, maybe you could start us off with this one.
So pitfalls when people think they've started, I think that's maybe trying to see accessibility as a checklist. So I've often seen that in teams where it's like, oh, if we have these 5 things checked off, then we're there. And that kind of forgets about the reality of, you also need to test with users, and you also want to make sure that the best practices that you use are actually good practices. And that is, I think, one of the harder things to get right in web accessibility, because there's a lot of code examples online that might be either out of date or might have bad browser support. So a lot of this comes down to actually ensuring that you've tested everything, as well as made sure that it works not just on browsers and assistive technologies, but also with end users. And thinking about it too easily and thinking, oh, I've just got these 5 checkpoints that I need to do. That's I think one of the pitfalls, and tricky for the long term to actually make sure that you get it right.
Okay, thank you. Kilian, what things have you seen out in the wild or have experienced yourself when you were starting this?
So I have a few very practical examples, and that's to do with developers trying to do the right thing, but not knowing precisely how what they're doing is interpreted by, for example, screen readers. So when it comes to describing an image or providing labels for landmarks, what I see very often is descriptions of images starting with picture of or image showing. And that's very good because that means developers are thinking about what is this image saying and what is it conveying. What they then don't know is that assistive technologies will announce that image as an image. So the assistive technology will literally say image of. So you can just leave that image of out and describe the image directly. And it's very difficult to realize that on your own because you're asked to describe something and naturally you go, well, this thing is yada, yada, yada. The same happens with navigation landmarks. So if you have a nav element, you can give that a name. And usually people just say, well, this is the main navigation. So I'm going to call it main navigation. That makes sense, right? But again, assistive technologies will tell a user that this is navigation. So that's going to be read out loud as navigation, main navigation, which again is that duplication so it's people trying to do the right thing, but then, there's the extra step of making sure that things are being announced as you think they should be announced.
That one's very recognizable for me. I've fallen into that trap on Twitter a long time until I realized this and learned this, and it's like, I'm just calling all images images. Good one to learn. Martine, maybe you could tell us some of the pitfalls that you've seen or that you've done yourself.
I think my favorite that I've seen in a while was my favorite, not in a good way, was an input field where the developer had tried to make it as accessible as possible. So it had a label by, a described by, a title, a placeholder. I mean, everything, and it all said the exact same thing. So the concept of more ARIA is not better. If you're going to have to use ARIA, know why you're using it and what it's actually doing. Just adding more of it isn't going to make your accessibility better. You have to add it to the right amount to the right places, not just hey, we're gonna ARIA everything and it'll be great. So that's maybe, and I've fallen into the trap of putting, a placeholder, a title, and a label that said the same thing at some point, I'm sure. Hopefully it's no longer in production. But that's the one I see the most, is people really wanting to do the best they can and going a little overboard. Just a little.
Okay. Next one is, these days we don't just have, we can click on websites, of course. These days we have mobile phones, we have tablets, we have computers with touchscreens, and we can do gestures as well as clicking with the mouse. Do you have any tips for making gestures more accessible? Kilian, maybe you can start us off with this one.
So I don't have any personal experience with that. So just to say that, but I guess, and if anyone else has some knowledge here, but if you provide gestures, also make sure you have an alternative way to trigger the same action, either by voice or by literal buttons or by key presses, shortcuts. Make sure that if someone doesn't have the motor skills or ability to make that gesture, that they can still perform the action.
Okay, that's, thank you. Martine, do you have anything else that you can add to this one?
Also, a button has there's a physical, generally label of what it does, right? Or what it's going to do. Same with the link. A gesture doesn't have any indication of what it's going to do. So there's a little bit of a barrier of even knowing that the gesture exists or is a thing or can be done. So if it's going to be like a primary way of interacting with the application, some kind of onboarding or tutorial. I mean, there needs to be some way for the user to know what the actions are, like what those gestures are and how, like what they're going to do. I think is probably really important as well.
Okay, and Hidde, do you have anything that you would like to add to this?
Yeah, I think most generally, like, never rely on one way of interacting. So Kilian touched on that, and basically for the reasons that Martine mentioned, you don't really want to rely on just one way. You want to make it clear that there are multiple ways, and if there are multiple ways, it's also more clear what's going to happen. So if you can interact with touch, then you should also be able to interact with a mouse or a keyboard.
Okay, thank you. And then I think we have time for one last question, and this one is quite dear to me because it's something I've struggled with in the past, and that is, do you have any advice on how companies can keep the doors open, as it were, so that employees feel safe when they are requesting accommodations to needs, making suggestions, etc.? Martine, maybe you can start us off with this one.
Having an accessibility statement, or even whether it's for your application or just as a company, having it part of your mission statement, or it's part of showing that it's a core part of what the company cares about, I think goes a very long way. And I mean, I would think of that just the same way as any human resource problem, right? There's whatever avenues you have in place for somebody being able to mention harassment or something like that, or to, accessibility, I would say, falls in the same boat. Not being able to have the correct accessibility to do your job is highly problematic, right? So from an exterior standpoint, making sure you have accessibility statements and some kind of channel to be able to receive the feedback of whatever the accessibility is, and same internally, really making sure you're making it clear and having that channel to be able to read a safe and possibly anonymous channel for that feedback.
I really like that one. That's really important, yeah. Hidde, do you have anything that you can add to here?
Yeah, I'd love to just plus one Martine's point here. I was going to say the same, like accessibility statements are a great way for that, both like internally and externally. Okay,
and Kilian?
I have nothing to add to that. Great answers.
Okay, awesome. I think we're coming up on time. We have to. Do we have any more questions in the chat? I'm looking at the people that are passing things across. In which case, I would like to give you three the chance to maybe give a closing thing on something that you think is really important about accessibility. Kilian, could you maybe give us your closing? This is really important. Don't forget this.
Yeah, so Hidde mentioned in his talk a community group called Ali Feet, where the idea is that we're mapping out all the things browsers and other tools do to make accessibility easier for end users. And while we're not super active there yet, we do welcome any and all input. I think there's definitely a very large area where browsers and extensions can do much better and much more. And even though like all the developers should make perfect websites, the nature of things is that that's just not going to happen. So for a user, that also shouldn't really matter. If a browser can fix things for them and they can use the website, that's just as good. So yeah, it would be great to get that going more. So please check that out. If you go to, I think it's alifeed.com, but Hidde can back me up on that. Or just Google for the Ali Feed community working group.
Okay, thank you. In which case, I think that is an awesome segue to say, Hidde, maybe you can give us your closing. Don't forget this and confirm that URL for us.
So that URL was corrected. It is alifeed.com. Yeah, do feel free to join us there. Yeah, one thing I could add maybe is don't try to measure how many people need accessibility support. That's a common pitfall that I forgot to mention earlier. Because if you are trying to figure out how many of your users have disabilities, you're not measuring the users that are shopping with your competitor, because they might not be on your website just because it isn't accessible. So that's, I think, a great thing to either take into account for your own website, or if you work with clients, tell them about this, because we've got to get some competition going between websites, who can be the most accessible and who can serve the most people.
Okay, thank you. And then Martine, as our last panelist for today, excuse me, maybe you could give us your closing words and what you think is really important for somebody to, if they want to get started.
I think you mentioned a great point with the people, and I think we forget, we get into our developer mode with, I have all of my tests I need to pass, and I need to make sure this happens, and we think of it very programmatically, forgetting the people aspect behind it. And so don't forget that you're doing this for your users, you're doing this for a person. Yes, there's robots in the middle to help us get from point A to point B, but the end user is still a person. And so that feedback from your users is incredibly important, incredibly valuable, and especially if you're starting on an accessibility journey, it might really tell you what are the areas that may be to focus on first that is going to help your users the most.
Awesome. I think that's one that we should definitely keep in mind a lot more when we're making code. Well, I see that we're out of time. I think that was a perfect way to end it, and I would really like to thank all three of you for spending this half an hour to go through some questions and help people when they're getting started. Thank you. And have a good evening, of course, or morning.